It is possible I already had some presentiment of my future. The locked and rusted gate that stood before us, with wisps of river fog threading its spikes like the mountain paths, remains my mind now as a symbol of my exile. That is why I have begun this account of it with the aftermath of our swim, in which I, the torturer's apprentice Severian, had so nearly drowned. Shadow of the Torturer.
The above extract is from the first chapter of Shadow of the Torturer, Resurrection and Death. So today, we're going to talk about Jane Wolfe and his book of the New Sun. I'll assume you haven't read the series or are not very familiar with the rest of Wolfe's work, and the main aim of this video essay today is to introduce you the reason why this text or this series has fascinated and enraptured me, and to convince you, hopefully, to read the books. The first segment will serve as the introduction to Wolfe's life and work, and the next we'll discuss and analyze some aspects of his work, focusing on Severian and some selected quotes from the text. There will be spoilers for the entire Book of the New Sun and the coda, Urth of the New Sun, but I'll try to keep it brief and minimize the exact details spoiled. Rodwin Wolfe was born in New York City on May 7th, 1931, the son of Mary Olivia and Emerson Leroy Wolfe. He contracted polio as a small child and moved to Houston when he was 6, attending high school and college there, Lamar High School and Texas A&M University respectively. He published his first speculative fiction in The Commentator, a student literary journal, while he was at Texas A&M, and early in his writing career, Wolfe exchanged correspondence with J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, why am I talking about all of this? Jokes for the death of the author aside, there are 3 events in Wolfe's life that will help majorly in the understanding of his work. First, Wolfe was born Presbyterian, but converted to Catholicism in his 40s. Second, that Wolfe was educated as and worked as an engineer for most of his working life. And third, consequent to that, he invented and patented the machine that produces Pringle chips as we know of them today. Excellent. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at his body of work before he started on the Book of the New Sun. So here first, we have Operation Aries, his first published novel, published in 1970, The Fifth Head of Cerberus, 1972, Peace, 1975, and The Devil in the Forest, 1976. These 4 were his first published novels, all standalone, all generally unremarkable, sans The Fifth Head of Cerberus, which is generally known to be his breakthrough novel. Peace is generally critically acclaimed by die-hard fans of Wolfe, but is not very popular amongst the wider audience. The Fifth Head of Cerberus, on the other hand, is relatively well-known and critically acclaimed. However, what Wolfe is best known for is his Book of the New Sun, which is also what most readers will probably have been introduced to Wolfe through. The Book of the New Sun is a tetralogy, which began with the Shadow of the Torturer, followed by the Claw of the Conciliator, Sword of the Lictor, and then Citadel of the Autarch. There's also a coda to the Book of the New Sun, titled The Urth of the New Sun, the 5th book of the tetralogy, which is quite funny. And on the similar note, Wolfe had intended for Shadow to be a standalone novella, titled The Feast of St. Catherine, if I recall, but it turned out to have to be split into a tetralogy by the time he had finished. The series being first published in the early 1980s, I was introduced to it in probably late 2020 or early 21 through a Reddit thread recommending the series, if I recall. I had been working my way through the Malazan Book of the Fallen and then stalled maybe halfway through, as many do, and the Book of the New Sun had garnered a sort of odd mystique to my teenage brain. It's known to be notoriously difficult, prone to leaving the reader confused, and generally a polarizing experience all around. I'd actually seen it most on those sort of threads that talk about the kinds of series people should not be recommending to readers at every available opportunity, those kinds of series that are wrongly recommended, well, a little like the Malazan books, which draws readers into the black hole that is the Book of the New Sun. I sourced a copy of Shadow of the Torturer online, as one does, absolutely and completely legally, and down I went through the looking glass and into the warren of rabbit holes that is Wolfe. The Book of the New Sun was completed during Wolfe's time working as an editor of an engineering magazine, and was written more or less wholesale before he submitted it for publication. These larger inspiring forces behind the Book of the New Sun is of course the Dying Earth genre or trope that was spearheaded first by Jack Vance's The Dying Earth, published in 1950. To be entirely honest, the specific genre of The Dying Earth is not particularly well reflected in modern work, But the larger genre of apocalyptic and post-disaster fiction is very common, all the way from Hunger Games to Legend of Zelda to Warhammer 40k to I Am Legend, and you get the point. While the apocalypse is not the essential point of the Book of the New Sun, critics like Peter Wright have dubbed it an apotheosis of traditional dying of elements and themes, and the very nomenclature of this Book of the New Sun evokes the notion of this renewal. The other source of inspiration that Wolfe drew upon, of course, is his Catholic faith. The hagiographical background of the text is very evident, both in the name of the Feast of St. Catherine, one of the opening chapters of Shadow of the Torturer, and Wolfe takes a very much medieval view of the cosmology within his works. There are these little gods of Zadkiel and angels and hierodeals, yet all beneath Severian as his Christ analogue of the New Sun. There are some complications with this view of Wolfe and Severian, of course. While Severian performs his miracles of turning water into wine or resurrecting the dead, the case of Dorcas, he is still an executioner and torturer, who really does not have much problem with violence to achieve his ends. I'll discuss more about Severian later, but it does require more depth to be delved into for the works and story to fully flesh it out. Most who've heard of this series but never read it, or have tried perhaps, have probably heard about the reputation the Book of the New Sun has to be inscrutable to a reader. You may have been put off hearing people talk about how the plot doesn't make much sense, it's not very linear, etc. This reputation is not entirely undeserved. A reader that isn't paying too much attention, or one that is not used to the kind of nuances and tricks Wolfe employs, will suffer from a certain lack of understanding. But a distinct tool that Wolfe uses to try and force the reader to engaging the text at a deeper level is his puzzles. The premier example of this is perhaps one of the things the series is most famous for, its use of these Greek and Roman root words that are, while valid, very obscure and complicates the understanding of the text. By drawing back upon Wolfe's background, his deliberate assumption of his Catholic faith and his role as a man of science in his training and work as engineer is very much reflected in the text, insofar that despite Wolfe's heavy use of allusion and language and puzzle, he never left any diary or memoir to shed light on his influences or worldview. The central riddle posed by himself, the author, in the Book of the New Sun remains within the work, allowing the work to stand on its own feet. Point being, Wolfe is subsumed beneath his work even as he writes and shapes it. Starting off, a brief summary of the story of the Book of the New Sun is effectively a torturer, Severian, who is cast out of his guild in the far future because he's had mercy on a client. By mercy, we means Severian gives the client, Thecla, an avenue, a knife, to kill herself before her actual execution date. In this case, her execution method, it's this machine called the Revolutionary, an ECG-looking machine that would alter Thecla's mind to cause herself to kill herself very painfully in a prolonged fashion. So, by his mercy, he's sent into exile to act as the lictor for a town named Thrax, and given the sword, the Terminus Est, for his duties as executioner. And on his way to Thrax, he comes across this religious, seemingly magical icon, which is the Claw of the Conciliator. So most of the 4 volumes is Severian trying to make it to Thrax and return the Claw to the Peregrines, who are this religious sect the Claw comes from. This larger idea is that Severian himself is narrating the Book of the New Sun. The work is couched as a translation by Wolfe of the text that Severian himself penned down, which is also known as the Book of the New Sun. A central part of the narrative surrounding Severian, or more importantly the narrative that Severian himself provides, is his self-professed eidetic memory. Severian's perfect memory is emphasized throughout the text, where he states his memory does not fade and personifies it to when summoned carries him off spellbound. Similarly, he does state again that he is tormented by relentless memory, and that it is a demonic witness which dwells behind his eyes. Severian is also crowded by his memories, where he states that his memories came crowding unbidden around, with this sense of unbidden and crowding giving a sense of swarming and claustrophobia. In my opinion, the more important aspect is what this memory does to his thinking and way of thought. It's generally agreed that Borges's Funes el Memorioso was a major influence to Wolfe here, and in that story the narrator theorizes that it is detrimental to Funes' capacity of abstract thought. To quote the Wikipedia article, Funes can distinguish every physical object at every distinct time of viewing. He has no clear need of generalization or detail suppression for the management of sense impressions. The narrator claims that this prevents abstract thought, given that induction and deduction rely on this ability. This is stated in the line, "To think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. In the overly replete world of Funes, there were nothing but details." That's what I think is the most central aspect of his unreliability. Severin gets so lost in the details and misses the big picture. However, the importance of the reader's judgment is highlighted as well through the establishment of Severin's unreliability, and therefore the need to determine the truth of the narratives that we are presented with. Severin's externalization of his memory disguises his fallibility and changes made to his recollections, with the free direct speech of Claw intimating his truthfulness, but making explicit that Severin is the filter that the understanding of the text is constructed through. In the same literary breath that Severin extols his perfect memory, he states that Vaudulus gave his pistol to his mistress and drew his sword, in Claude the Conciliator, when in Shadow of the Torturer, Vaudulus indeed passes the pistol to his bodyguard Hildegard instead. This mistake being purposefully hidden within a passage that declares the inerrancy of his memory, and being bookended in two separate assertions of his memory that remains always and does not fade, which initially does evoke a sense of trust in Severin, but on closer examination instead results in this mistrust of his recollections. As an aside for some further reading, there has been work by critics that link Marcel Proust's remembrance of things past to Severin's own accounts in the novel. A quick rundown of Proust's own work: The Remembrance of Things Past is purportedly by a narrator who remains unnamed throughout, who discusses his childhood, learning about art and growing up and such. The pertinent comparison here, first made by critic Marc Aramini, is that the narrator receives a letter after the death of his paramour, perhaps Albertine, and it involuntarily evokes a memory of her, which is similar with the death of Thecla, where Severin received that forged letter, and he believes for an instant that Thecla remains alive, or when Severin consumes the Alzabo soup, this slurry of brain matter and chemicals that gives him Thecla's involuntary memories. Wolfe certainly also takes some lines like "all men love that which they destroy," and "time turns our lies into truth," and "that being who we are remains our unforgivable sin," almost wholesale from some of the volumes of Proust. Oh, Wolfe, you hack. But in the end, Severin's eidetic memory is, in my personal interpretation, not something that can be questioned to any large extent. That Severin's memory, whatever the reader may think, is intended by Wolfe to be more or less perfect, and it's the things that Severin doesn't mention, those lies by omission about things that are embarrassing, perhaps, or inconvenient, that makes it truly interesting. We must also acknowledge of Severin as self-serving, and this acknowledgement feeds into that perception of him as the chosen one, as a savior of Earth that brings a new sun. Wolfe had intended Severin to be a Christ analogue, but a flawed human analogue indeed. His cross that Severin bears isn't the object of penance, that object of punishment and humiliation that Jesus of Nazareth carried up Calvary Hill. Severin carries the terminus est, his cross analogue, a massive executioner's sword that proclaims Severin's role as inescapably a torturer. Yet that seemingly contradictory statement aligns Severin in the role of Christ, the Saviour, in an odd way. In the books, the terminus est name is translated, "Here is the line of division," where the sword and Severin by extension are here to represent that change, that line drawn in the sand to save the people of Earth by ushering in the new sun. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 34 to 36, I read, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to this earth. I have not come to bring peace but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against a mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." Jesus noted this to foreground his own awareness that the word he was spreading at the time would usher in this change and division, but its necessity for man to be saved. However, despite Severin's parallel to Christ, Severin is careless, selfish, immature, judgmental, casually violent, arrogant, prideful. Severin kills a man, protecting the sanctity of a loved one's graves in the necropolis. He steals food, he lusts after Asia, and gets duped into being complicit in the theft of the claw. Severin is the man who is practicing his trade of violence and torture and punishment for coins thrown in the dirt at his feet, scourging, chopping off hands, beating, everything else. But yet, Severin can also be idealistic, dutiful, fair-minded, respectful of tradition, merciful, and concerned about being better. He reflects and changes, and even at the start of Shadow, he notes that he could not let a man die because it would have been a breaking of faith with something within himself. If he had been a man for such a short time, he could endure to think that he had become a man so different from the boy he had been. He further goes on to state that I could remember each moment of my past, every vagrant thought and sight, every dream. How could I destroy the past? I held up my hands and tried to look at them. I knew the veins stood out on their backs now. It's when those veins stand out that one is a man. Yet this self-monologue is extremely seductive, and those looking for power fantasy easily fall in line with Severin's self-image, and so can overlook some of Severin's more unseemly actions. But if we take Severin as a one-note character, either truly good or truly evil, we are really missing out on how much of the thematic and narrative depth in the story that he brings. What truly matters in the end is that Severin is human as you and I, exaggerated and polarized in both his nobility and savagery. I'll end off with a quote from Wolfe himself. I don't think that Severin as being a Christ figure. I think of Severin as being a Christian figure. He is a man who has been born into a very perverse background, who is gradually trying to become better. In the end, Severin is human, he is Savior, he is God. He is everything in between, and in retaining his humanity makes the Book of the New Sun truly fascinating to me. Severin's role in the text aside, the allegory and symbolic in the Book of the New Sun is truly an integral part of Wolfe's construction of the Book of the New Sun. Of course, as previously mentioned, Severin as Christ occupies a significant portion of the discourse around the symbolic, but there is much to explore in the varied layers of the text. At the start of the Shadow of the Torture, Severin is handed a coin by Vaudulus and is told that, I read, we believe that we invent symbols. The truth is that they invent us. We are their creatures, shaped by their hard-defining edges. When soldiers take their oath, they are given a coin, and a simi stamped to the profile of the autarch. Of course, at the end of Citadel of the Autarch, the last book of the Book of the New Sun, Severin learns that the coin was a mere cheap counterfeit, if I recall, and that interpolation of duty or service that Severin imbibes at the start of Shadow perhaps intuits an understanding of the driving force behind him is not solely his own. Similarly, this sense of duty is perhaps mirrored in the divinity that Severin places in the claw, when Severin notes that the thorn was a sacred claw because all thorns were sacred claws. The sand in my boots was sacred sand because it came from a beach of sacred sand. The Cenobites treasured up the relics of the Sannyasins because the Sannyasins had approached the Pancreator, but everything had approached and even touched the Pancreator because everything had dropped from his hand. Everything was a relic. All the world was a relic. I drew off my boots that travelled with me so far and threw them into the wave, that I might not walk shod on holy ground. Of course, the claw as a religious symbol is heavily reinforced by the Catholic background of Wolfe and is indeed deeply steeped in Catholic tradition, where Severin refers to the blue shell as the pyx when he finds the claw wedged between the rocks. A pyx, in Catholic tradition, is the box or container in which the consecrated host, the Eucharist, is kept, and also can mean the container in which the supplies for wafers for the Eucharist are kept. Of course, the light of the claw is notably white, blindingly so, another reference to the future of the new sun that Severin was to bring, because of course, in the world of the new sun, the sun is dying, and the deep red sun stains all. As an aside, the literary significance of the play Eschatology in Genesis in the Claw of the Conciliator cannot be denied, with allusions and allegory that draw attention to the artifice in the construction of this narrative. In Eschatology in Genesis, it's stated that it's a dramatization, as Talos claimed, of the lost book of the new sun, with the aside that's created by the parentization and the aside of as Talos claimed, as well as the use of the word claimed, connotes Severin's ignorance of the veracity of the statement, despite his role in writing the identically titled Book of the New Sun. The play distances and alienates the reader from the text with the inversion of eschatology in Genesis, the end and the beginning, evoking this deep sense of unease. The nomenclature of the cast of this play within the play is also alluding to both Zoroastrian and Christian tradition, with Messiah, Meshian, and Yahi, or Jahi perhaps, being romanizations of the Zoroastrian Adam and Eve and Lilith respectively, along with the giant Nod alluding to the Nephilim, deuterocanonical offspring of angels and humans, which conveys the inhumanity of the characters. Within the play, the 7-act structure mirrors that of the 7 days of creation of Genesis, yet the 7th act, the supposed arrival of the new sun, is never shown due to the arrival of the autochthonous men disrupting the play, removing all sense of resolution. The appendix of Claw, which is titled Social Relationships in the Commonwealth, is instead also an inversion. It introduces the reader to the world of Claw rather than being a postscript to the text itself. Wolfe thus in the appendix undermines the reader's conception of the very words Wolfe has used in the text, indicating they are nothing more than a sketch, giving a sense of the indeterminacy and lack of accuracy of Wolfe's translation, and the understanding of the very time frames within the text is dulled, and words indicative of duration seldom occur. By breaking down this relationship between sign and signified in the provision of words as a mere stopgap measure in its translation to approximate the meaning of the supposed original manuscript, Wolfe thus invites the reader to ponder upon the dual meanings of our reality within the textual reality of the words that he so deliberately chooses, and thus recontextualizes the understanding of the text to utilize these multiple meanings each sign may signify, suggesting this difficulty of interpreting reality that Wolfe does hammer through in the Book of the New Sun. Is this epigraph from a hymn called Our God, Our Help, written by Isaac Watts, that reads, 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. And many of the themes of this book are really ensconced in this brief quotation, especially if you look at the entire song. So I will flash the psalm above, and this is Our God, Our Help by Isaac Watts. If you look at this text, you can already see that the idea of the revelation of all of mankind that is going to be decimated, carried downwards by the flood, that this great decimation of a flood, and this is indeed what happens in the Earth of the New Sun. You know exactly that this is going to happen, and this is also repeated in the embedded play in Cloth Constellated, again, as Chatol in Genesis, where it recapitulates the story of Adam and Eve, and, well, this notion of that the old ages of man are going to be swept away in the Book of the New Sun, and the new sun is this light that is going to bring flowery fields, and, well, is seen again in this psalm above. Of course, we can't really speak about Wolfe without at least mentioning the language of the Askins. So the Askins are these people whose name derives from a Latin word meaning without shadow, because they live to the north of Severin's home city of Nessus and the Citadel, and so on the equator, and thus have no shadow at noon. I won't go too much detail because I'm not extensively familiar with linguistics, but here goes. The language of the Askins is similar to the Newspeak of Orwell's 1984 in function, in denying Askins the capability of critical thought. This is achieved through adult Askins not understanding plain Askin sentences unless they are direct quotations from governmental propaganda materials, referred to as correct thought. Thus, in order to communicate, an Askin memorizes the propaganda quotations and speaks in these quotations, and cannot understand anything said to them that are not those aphorisms. This, of course, brings up the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the notion of linguistic determinism and relativity. With the former, the notion that language controls or determines thought, and once done so, we cannot think outside the constraints of their language system, while the latter being the notion that language influences thought instead. Hence, we can borrow, translate, and perform circumlocutions to fill lexical gaps. Hence, there can be distinctions encoded in one language that are not found in any other language. From this passage by Sapir-Whorf, or rather Wolfe himself, we dissect nature along lines laid down by native languages. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds, and this means largely by linguistic systems in our minds. We cut nature up, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community as codifying patterns of languages. Of course, the Askins is also an exploration of the notion of utopianism, but I'd also argue it's also a reflection of a book that's written during the Cold War by a man who fought communists in Korea. And, well, the Askins are a society where all people pledge extreme and absolute universal loyalty to the state and are required to act in slave-like subservience to the state. Individualism is crushingly suppressed to the extent where citizens are only allowed to utter phrases approved by the state. It's very much more on the nose than the rest of the Book of the New Sun, but still very much a valid critique, even though some, including me, have found it out of place in the hazy opaqueness of the rest of the text. That is a brief overview and dive into the allegorical and symbolism of the Book of the New Sun, which primarily serves to create this very fantastical, very medieval aesthetic, which cultivates another sense of wonder in the reader, and further serves to create a depth of prose and story. It does deserve its own video and deeper dives into its significance, but that's about it for now. I hope you found it interesting. So, I'm new to this, so do let me know how the editing and sound quality can be improved and such, and thanks for listening. Bye.